At 2:17 a.m. on July 29, 1945, Chief Boatswain's Mate Leonard Arthur Cahill felt the deck vanish beneath his feet. One moment he was standing watch on the starboard bridge wing of the USS Ashworth, a destroyer escort running convoy duty in the Philippine Sea. The next moment the ship was breaking apart, her back snapped by a Japanese torpedo that had struck the forward engine room without warning. 34 years old, 17 years in the Navy, veteran of 2 oceans and 3 amphibious landings, and he was falling through darkness toward water he could not see. The Ashworth had been a lucky ship. That's what her crew believed anyway. Commissioned in March 1944, she had survived 14 months of Pacific combat without losing a single man. She had screened carriers at Leyte Gulf, had shot down 2 kamikazes off Okinawa, had weathered a typhoon that sank 3 destroyers in December 1944. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander William Harrell, kept a horseshoe nailed above his cabin door, and the crew joked that the ship was charmed. The charm ran out 400 miles east of the Philippines. The Japanese submarine I-367 had been stalking the convoy for 6 hours. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Yoshiro Tanaka, was one of the last experienced submarine commanders left in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Most of his contemporaries were dead, killed by American destroyers, aircraft, or the grinding attrition of a war Japan was already losing. Tanaka had survived through patience, through caution, through an almost preternatural ability to sense danger before it materialized. He had sunk 11 ships in 3 years of war. The Ashworth would be his 12th. The I-367 was a Type C 3-cargo submarine, originally designed to ferry supplies to isolated island garrisons, but converted to combat operations as Japan's conventional submarines were destroyed one by one. She was slow and ungainly compared to fleet boats, but she carried a load of 6 Type 95 torpedoes, the finest torpedoes in any navy, powered by pure oxygen, capable of speeds over 50 knots, leaving almost no wake to betray their approach. Tanaka had been tracking the convoy since dusk, running submerged during daylight to avoid detection by American patrol aircraft, surfacing after sunset to charge his batteries and close the distance. He had watched the convoy's pattern, identified its weakest point, a destroyer escort on the starboard flank, running slightly behind station, her radar sweeping predictably, her sonar operators apparently asleep. The Ashworth. At 2:14 a.m., Tanaka fired 2 torpedoes at a range of 1,800 yards. The first torpedo missed, running ahead of the Ashworth's bow. The second struck home. The torpedo struck at 2:17 a.m., hitting the destroyer escort just forward of amidships, directly beneath the forward engine room. The 1,200-pound warhead detonated against the hull, and the explosion tore through the ship like a thunderclap through tissue paper. The forward engine room flooded in seconds. The keel cracked. The Ashworth, 306 feet of American steel, began to die. Cahill was thrown 40 feet through the air. He hit the water at an angle, the impact driving the breath from his lungs, and went under. The Philippine Sea at night was warm, 84 degrees, bathwater temperature, but the shock of sudden immersion disoriented him. He could not tell which way was up. He could not see anything in the absolute blackness. He could feel himself sinking, his dungarees and boots dragging him down, and for a long moment he was certain he was going to drown. Then training took over. Cahill had been in the Navy since 1928, had survived a dozen emergencies at sea, had pulled men from the water after ship collisions and aircraft crashes and enemy attacks. He knew what to do. He kicked off his boots one at a time, feeling them disappear into the darkness below. He clawed at his dungaree shirt, pulling it over his head, reducing the drag that was pulling him down. He forced himself to stop struggling, to let his body's natural buoyancy assert itself. He surfaced 15 feet from the Ashworth's sinking hull. The ship was breaking in half. Cahill could see it in the dim light of the fires burning on the forward section, the hull bending, the deck buckling, the superstructure tilting at impossible angles. Men were screaming, men were jumping, men were dying, trapped in compartments that were flooding faster than they could escape. The stern section, still afloat, was already 20 feet higher than the bow. The Ashworth carried a complement of 186 officers and men. Of those, approximately 60 were killed in the initial explosion or trapped in compartments that flooded before they could escape. Another 30 were wounded, some critically, struggling in the water with burns and broken bones and shrapnel wounds. The remaining 96 survivors were scattered across a quarter-mile of ocean, clinging to debris, calling for help, trying to find each other in the darkness. Cahill began to swim. He had been a competitive swimmer in his youth, back in Fall River, Massachusetts, where he had grown up the son of a Portuguese fishing boat captain. The waters off Massachusetts were cold and rough, nothing like the warm Philippine Sea, and Cahill had learned to swim in conditions that would have drowned most men. He had won the New England Championship in the mile freestyle at 17, had been offered a scholarship to a college in Boston, but his father had died that same year, lost at sea in a winter storm, and Cahill had joined the Navy instead to support his mother and 3 younger sisters. The Navy had made good use of his swimming ability. He had served as a rescue swimmer on 3 different ships, had pulled drowning men from the water more times than he could count, had earned a reputation as the man you wanted in the water when things went wrong. But he had never faced anything like this. The first survivor he reached was a young seaman, maybe 19 years old, floating face down in a spreading pool of oil. Cahill grabbed him, turned him over, checked for breathing. Nothing. The boy's chest was still, his eyes open and fixed. Shrapnel had torn through his neck, severing the carotid artery. He had bled out in the water, probably within seconds of hitting the surface. Cahill let him go. There would be time to mourn later. Right now, the living needed him. The second survivor was Ensign Robert Whitmore, the ship's assistant communications officer. Whitmore was 23 years old, fresh from the Naval Academy on his first combat deployment. He was clinging to a piece of wooden grating, his left arm hanging limp, his face pale with shock. The arm was broken in at least 2 places. Cahill could see the unnatural angle even in the darkness. "Ensign, can you hear me?" Whitmore's eyes focused slowly. "Chief? Chief Cahill?" "Yeah, it's me. I need you to hold on to this grating. Don't let go. I'm going to find more survivors, and I'll come back for you. Understand?" "My arm?" "I know. Don't try to use it. Just hold on with your right hand. I'll be back." Cahill swam on. The oil was everywhere now, spreading from the Ashworth's ruptured fuel tanks, coating the surface of the water in a thick, viscous layer. The oil made swimming harder, made breathing harder, made everything harder. It got in Cahill's eyes, in his mouth, in his nose. It burned, it stank. It turned the warm Philippine Sea into something toxic and terrible. He found a group of 6 men clinging to a life raft that had deployed automatically when the ship broke apart. The raft was designed to hold 20, but it was upside down, its inflation chambers keeping it afloat but useless for sheltering survivors. The men were holding onto the ropes that hung from its sides, their heads barely above water. "Chief?" The voice belonged to Machinist's mate First Class Theodore Kowalski, a 28-year-old from Chicago who had served with Cahill on 2 previous ships. "Chief, thank God. We thought everyone on the bridge was dead." "Not yet." Cahill grabbed one of the ropes, pulling himself alongside the raft. "Who else is here?" Kowalski named them: Seaman First Class Martinez, Fireman Second Class O'Brien, Gunner's Mate Third Class Washington, Electrician's Mate Second Class Petrov, and Ship's Cook Third Class Williams. 6 men, all enlisted, all relatively uninjured. The explosion had caught them in the aft berthing compartment, and they had escaped through a hatch that had blown open from the pressure. "Anyone seen the captain?" Cahill asked. Silence. Then Kowalski shook his head. "Bridge took a direct hit, Chief. The whole superstructure came down. I don't think anyone up there made it." Lieutenant Commander Harrell, the horseshoe above his cabin door. Cahill had served under Harrell for 11 months, had come to respect the man's quiet competence, his genuine concern for his crew, his unshakable calm in combat. Now he was gone, killed in the same explosion that had thrown Cahill into the sea. "All right," Cahill said. "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to flip this raft over. Then we're going to start collecting survivors. Anyone who can swim helps me search. Anyone who can't stays with the raft. We're not losing anyone else tonight. Understood?" The men understood. Flipping the life raft took 10 minutes of coordinated effort. The raft was heavy, waterlogged, and the inflation chambers resisted every attempt to roll it. But Cahill had flipped rafts before, and he knew the technique. He positioned 3 men on one side, 3 on the other, and on his count, they pulled and pushed in unison. The raft rolled, righted itself, and suddenly they had shelter. A rubber platform 12 feet across, with rope handles around the perimeter and a small canvas canopy that could be raised against the sun. Kowalski, you're in charge of the raft. Keep it here, as close to the wreck as you can. I'm going to start searching. Chief, you can't search alone. It's too dark, too much area. Then send someone with me when you can spare them. But right now, this raft is the only thing keeping these men alive. You stay with it. Cahill slipped back into the water and began to swim. If you want to see how a single sailor swimming through oil and darkness managed to save 93 men from the Philippine Sea, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Cahill. The night became a blur of swimming, searching, and rescuing. Cahill developed a pattern. Swim outward from the raft in a widening spiral, calling out every 30 seconds, listening for responses. When he found survivors, he would assess their condition. Those who could swim, he directed back toward the raft. Those who couldn't, he towed himself, sometimes 2 at a time, using the rescue techniques he had practiced for 17 years. At 3:15 a.m., he found a cluster of 8 men holding onto a piece of the ship's deck planking. 3 of them were wounded, burns mostly from the engine room explosion, and the other 5 were exhausted, barely keeping their heads above water. Cahill organized them into a chain, the strongest swimmers supporting the weakest, and led them back to the raft in a slow, painful procession that took almost 40 minutes. At 4:02 a.m., he found Lieutenant James Hendricks, the ship's gunnery officer, floating alone nearly 300 yards from the main group of survivors. Hendricks was unconscious, kept afloat by his life jacket, bleeding from a head wound that had turned the water around him pink. Cahill checked his pulse, weak but present, and began the long tow back to the raft. At 4:47 a.m., he found a group of 15 men who had managed to launch one of the ship's motor whaleboats before she sank. The whaleboat's engine was dead, flooded by the same explosion that had destroyed the ship, but it was still floating, and 15 men were crammed into a space designed for 12. Cahill tied the whaleboat to the life raft with a length of rope salvaged from the wreckage, creating a small flotilla of survivors. By dawn, Cahill had personally located and rescued 34 men. He had swum an estimated distance of nearly 4 miles, crisscrossing the debris field in the darkness, guided by nothing but the sound of voices and the dim light of the oil fires that still burned on the water. He had not rested. He had not stopped. He had simply kept swimming, because stopping meant that men would die. The sun rose at 5:52 a.m., revealing the full scope of the disaster. The Ashworth was gone. Only scattered debris marked where she had sunk. Wooden planking, life jackets, oil drums, the detritus of a ship's violent death. The oil slick spread across nearly a square mile of ocean, a dark stain on the blue Philippine Sea. And scattered across that oil slick in rafts and boats and clinging to wreckage were the survivors. Cahill counted heads as the light improved. The life raft held 23 men, packed so tightly that some were sitting on others' laps. The whaleboat held 15. Another 31 survivors were distributed among smaller pieces of wreckage: wooden grating, empty oil drums, pieces of the ship's wooden deck. 8 men floated in life jackets alone, too injured or too exhausted to reach the larger groups. 77 survivors. Cahill had hoped for more. The wounded were the most urgent problem. Lieutenant Hendricks, the gunnery officer, had regained consciousness but was clearly concussed, unable to focus his eyes or answer simple questions. Ensign Whitmore's broken arm had swollen to twice its normal size, the skin tight and discolored. 3 men had second-degree burns covering their arms and faces, the skin already blistering in the tropical sun. Another man, Seaman First Class Rodriguez, had taken shrapnel to the abdomen and was bleeding internally. Cahill could see the distension, could see the man's color fading from brown to gray. There was almost nothing Cahill could do for them. The life raft contained a small emergency kit, bandages, morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, but it was designed for minor injuries, not catastrophic trauma. He used what he had, binding wounds, administering morphine to the men in the worst pain, but he knew it was not enough. Without real medical care, the seriously wounded would die, and real medical care was nowhere in sight. The convoy had continued on without them. This was standard procedure. A convoy did not stop for a torpedoed ship, could not stop because stopping made the other ships targets for the same submarine that had just attacked. The Ashworth sister ships would have radioed for help, would have reported the sinking, but rescue was hours away at best, days away at worst. Chief, Kowalski's voice was hoarse, strained. What do we do now? Cahill looked at the men around him. Exhausted faces, frightened faces, faces that were looking to him for answers he did not have. He was the senior enlisted man among the survivors. With the captain dead and most of the officers killed or wounded, command had devolved to him by default. These men were his responsibility now. We wait, he said. The convoy will have reported our position. Search planes will be looking for us by noon. We stay together, we conserve our strength, and we wait. And if they don't find us? They'll find us. Cahill made his voice confident, certain. He was not certain at all. But just in case, we need to prepare. Water is our biggest problem. The sun's going to be brutal today, and dehydration will kill us faster than anything else. I want everyone who can work to start collecting rainwater gear, canvas, tarps, anything that can catch water if it rains. And I want a head count. I need to know exactly how many men we have and what condition they're in. The morning passed in grim activity. Cahill organized the survivors into work details, assigning tasks based on ability and injury. The strongest men paddled the whaleboat, trying to gather scattered survivors and debris. The wounded rested in the raft, shaded by the canvas canopy that the men had rigged from salvaged material. Everyone else worked, splicing rope, securing wreckage, preparing for a rescue that might not come. At 9:30 a.m., Seaman First Class Rodriguez died. The internal bleeding had been too severe, the damage too extensive. He was 22 years old from San Antonio, Texas. He had been engaged to a girl named Maria, had shown Cahill her photograph just 3 days earlier. Now he was dead, his body sliding into the Philippine Sea, committed to the deep with words that Cahill remembered from 100 burial services. At 11:15 a.m., Cahill spotted the survivors. They were nearly a mile away, a cluster of dark shapes on the glittering water, visible only because the sun was now high enough to illuminate the entire debris field. Cahill counted at least a dozen figures, maybe more, clinging to what appeared to be a section of the ship's hull. They were drifting away from the main group, carried by a current that was slowly separating them from any hope of rescue. Kowalski, give me 2 men, strong swimmers. Chief, you've been in the water for 9 hours. You need to rest. Those men are drifting away. If we don't reach them now, we never will. 2 men, now. Kowalski sent Martinez and Washington. The 3 men slipped into the water and began the long swim toward the distant survivors. The swim took nearly 2 hours. The current was against them, and the oil that still coated the surface made every stroke a battle. Cahill's arms burned, his legs cramped, his eyes, irritated by oil and salt, could barely focus, but he kept swimming, kept pushing, kept closing the distance between himself and the men who were drifting toward death. They reached the hull section at 1:23 p.m. What Cahill found there nearly broke him. There were 16 survivors clinging to the wreckage. 14 of them were already dead from wounds, from exhaustion, from the simple surrender of men who had lost the will to live. Their bodies floated in life jackets, bumping against the hull, their faces slack and empty. The 2 living survivors were barely conscious, their grips on the wreckage so weak that a single wave might have torn them loose. The living men were pharmacist's mate 2nd class Edward Larson and signalman 3rd class Anthony Greco. Larson was the ship's medic, a 26-year-old from Minnesota who had spent the night trying to save men who could not be saved. His hands were raw from holding on to the wreckage, his voice gone from calling for help. Greco was younger, maybe 20, a quiet kid from Brooklyn who had lied about his age to enlist. He was in shock, unresponsive to questions, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. "Can you swim?" Cahill asked Larson. "I don't know." The words were barely audible. I don't think so. Then hold on to me. Martinez, you take Greco. Washington, swim ahead and tell Kowalski we're coming. The swim back took 3 hours. Cahill towed Larson the entire way, the medic's arms wrapped around his neck, his weight dragging at Cahill's exhausted muscles. Martinez did the same with Greco. They swam in silence, conserving breath, counting strokes, focusing on nothing but the next pull through the water, the next kick, the next inch of progress toward the distant raft. They reached the main group at 4:45 p.m. Cahill had been in the water, swimming almost continuously, for over 14 hours. He had covered an estimated distance of more than 7 miles. He had personally rescued or assisted in the rescue of 38 survivors, and he was not done yet. Chief, Kowalski's face was grave. We lost 2 more while you were gone. Burns. They just gave up. 74 survivors now. Cahill nodded slowly, accepting the information, filing it away. Water situation? Bad. We found a few canteens in the whaleboat, maybe 2 gallons total. That's not enough for 70 men in this heat. Then we'll have to ration, 1/4 cup per man, every 4 hours, no exceptions. The afternoon sun was merciless. The temperature on the water approached 100 degrees, and there was no escape from it. The canvas canopy helped, but it could only shade a fraction of the survivors. Men who had survived the explosion and the night in the water began to suffer from heat exhaustion, from dehydration, from the slow baking of their bodies under the tropical sun. At 5:30 p.m., a Catalina flying boat appeared on the northern horizon. The men went wild. They screamed, they waved, they splashed the water to create visible spray. The signalmen among them used pieces of mirror to flash sunlight toward the distant aircraft. Kowalski ripped off his shirt and waved it over his head like a flag. Martinez stood on the edge of the raft, balancing precariously, making himself as tall as possible. Even the wounded raised themselves up, adding their voices to the desperate chorus. For 5 agonizing minutes, the Catalina flew toward them, growing larger and larger in the sky. Cahill could see the distinctive shape now, the high parasol wing, the twin engines, the boat-shaped hull designed for water landings. He could even see the white star insignia on the wings. American, friendly, rescue. The Catalina was perhaps 2 miles away when it began to turn. No, someone whispered. Then louder. No, no, no. The aircraft continued its turn, banking gracefully away from the survivors, following some predetermined patrol route that did not include the patch of oil-stained ocean where 74 men were fighting to stay alive. The pilot had not seen them, the oil slick, the debris, the desperate men waving from the water. None of it had been visible from the aircraft's altitude. The Catalina continued on its patrol route, disappearing over the southern horizon, leaving the survivors alone once again. A sound rose from the raft, a moan, almost animal in its grief, the collective voice of men who had just watched salvation fly away. Some men cursed, some men wept, some simply stared at the empty horizon, their faces blank with despair. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. Men who had been certain of rescue moments before now faced the possibility that they would not be found, that they would die here, that all their suffering had been for nothing. Cahill saw the despair spreading through the group like a disease. He stood up in the raft. His legs were shaking. His voice was hoarse. But he made himself speak, made himself project confidence he did not feel. Listen to me. That plane didn't see us. That means we need to be more visible. Tomorrow, at first light, we're going to spread out. Put men on every piece of wreckage. Cover as much area as possible. We're going to use everything we have to signal. Oil, clothing, anything that will show up against the water. They're looking for us. We just have to make sure they find us. And if they don't? The question came from somewhere in the back of the raft. What if they never find us? Then we survive until they do. I've been in the Navy for 17 years. I've seen men survive worse than this. We have water. We have shelter. We have each other. We're going to make it. Every single one of us. But only if we don't give up. So nobody gives up. That's an order. It was not much. It was words. Nothing but words. Spoken by a man who was as scared and exhausted as anyone else in the water. But it was enough. The despair did not disappear, but it receded. The men had something to hold on to, a plan, a purpose, a leader who refused to quit. The night that followed was endless. The wounded moaned and cried. The healthy men took turns keeping watch, scanning the darkness for ships or aircraft that never appeared. Cahill circulated among the survivors, checking on each man, offering encouragement, sharing the diminishing water supply. He did not sleep. He could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rodriguez sliding into the water, saw the 14 dead men clinging to the hull section, saw the Catalina turning away. At 2:17 a.m., exactly 24 hours after the torpedo struck, Cahill realized he was dying. The exhaustion had accumulated beyond his body's ability to compensate. His muscles were failing, his thoughts fragmenting, his vision narrowing to a dim tunnel. He had been awake for over 40 hours, had swum more than 7 miles, had pushed himself far beyond any reasonable limit. His body was shutting down. He told no one. If the men saw their leader failing, they would lose hope. So Cahill sat in the raft, conserving what little energy remained, and waited for dawn. The second sunrise came at 5:54 a.m. on July 30th, 1945. The survivors had been in the water for 27 hours. 3 more men had died during the night, 2 from wounds, 1 from simple exhaustion. 71 men remained. At 6:23 a.m., the destroyer USS Halligan appeared on the eastern horizon. This time, there was no mistake. The Halligan had been specifically dispatched to search for Ashworth survivors, guided by the convoy's distress report and the calculations of naval navigators who had estimated where the current would carry the wreckage. The destroyer spotted the oil slick first, then the debris, then the rafts and the men clinging to them. The reaction among the survivors was different this time. There was no screaming, no wild celebration. The men simply watched, silent, afraid to hope, afraid that this too would be a mirage, that the destroyer would turn away like the Catalina. Only when the Halligan's bow swung toward them, only when the signal lamp began to flash in their direction, only when they could hear the rumble of the destroyer's engines across the water, only then did they allow themselves to believe. "She sees us," Kowalski said, his voice cracking. "My God, she sees us." The rescue took 4 hours. The Halligan launched her motor whaleboat and her gig, and the boats made trip after trip, ferrying survivors from the water to the ship. The destroyer's crew lined the rails, reaching down to help exhausted men up the cargo nets, wrapping them in blankets, pressing cups of water and hot coffee into shaking hands. The ship's doctor and his corpsmen moved among the survivors, triaging the wounded, stabilizing those who could be saved. The wounded went first, hoisted aboard in wire stretchers, their faces gray with pain and blood loss. Then the weakest, the men who could no longer stand, who had to be lifted bodily into the boats. Then the able-bodied climbing down from the rafts into the whaleboat, looking back at the debris field where so many of their shipmates had died. Cahill went last, refusing to leave the water until every other survivor had been retrieved. At 10:47 a.m., Chief Boatswain's mate, Leonard Arthur Cahill, was lifted from the Philippine Sea. He had been in the water for 32 hours. He had swum an estimated total of 9 miles. He had personally rescued or assisted in the rescue of 41 survivors. 71 men had been alive when the Halligan arrived, but the number who ultimately survived was higher, 93. The additional 22 survivors came from other wreckage fields, scattered across miles of ocean, located by search aircraft that had been guided to the area by the Halligan's initial contact. All of them reported the same thing. During the night, a swimmer had found them, had organized them, had told them to hold on because rescue was coming. Some of them had been drifting alone, convinced they were going to die, when a voice had called out from the darkness, and a hand had grabbed their life jacket, and a man had told them that everything was going to be okay. Cahill did not remember all of these rescues. The night had become a blur, a continuous loop of swimming and searching and pulling men from the water. But the survivors remembered him. They remembered his voice, his grip, his absolute refusal to let them die. The Navy awarded Cahill the Navy Cross. The citation described his extraordinary heroism and his complete disregard for his own safety. It noted that he had personally rescued more than 40 sailors and had maintained morale and discipline among the survivors through his inspiring leadership and tireless efforts. It did not mention that he had nearly died doing it. It did not mention the dreams that would follow him for the rest of his life. Cahill spent 3 weeks in a naval hospital in the Philippines, recovering from exhaustion and exposure. The doctors told him he had been within hours of complete physical collapse when the Halligan found him. His kidneys had begun to fail, his heart rhythm was irregular, his body temperature had dropped despite the tropical heat, a sign of severe physiological distress. He returned to duty in September 1945. The war ended that same month, and Cahill found himself on a navy that no longer needed combat sailors. He considered retirement. He had enough years for a pension, enough memories to last several lifetimes, but the sea was all he knew. He stayed. He served another 12 years, rising to the rank of Chief Warrant Officer before finally retiring in 1957. He had spent 29 years in the Navy, had survived 2 wars, had served on 14 ships, but when people asked about his service, he rarely mentioned the medals or the promotions. He talked about the men he had served with, the men he had saved, the men he had lost. After retirement, Cahill returned to Fall River, Massachusetts. He married a woman named Helen Costa, a widow with 2 children who had lost her first husband at Guadalcanal. They had met at a Navy Relief Society dance in 1956, and Cahill had been drawn to her quiet strength, her understanding of what it meant to lose people to the sea. They bought a small house near the waterfront, a Cape Cod cottage with a view of the harbor, and Cahill took a job as a harbor master, guiding fishing boats in and out of the port where his father had worked half a century before. He raised Helen's children as his own, Michael and Patricia, 10 and 8 when he married their mother. He taught them to fish, to sail, to respect the ocean that had shaped so much of his life. He never told them the full story of the Ashworth, not until they were grown, not until Michael came home from Vietnam with his own stories of survival and loss. Then, one night on the porch, with the harbor lights twinkling in the darkness, Cahill told his son everything. "How did you keep going?" Michael asked. 16 hours in the water, in the dark, alone. How did you not give up?" Cahill was quiet for a long moment. "I kept hearing voices," he said finally. "Men calling for help. Every time I thought I couldn't swim another stroke, I'd hear another voice, and I'd have to find it. I couldn't stop. Stopping meant someone died." He never swam again after the war. The water had given him everything, and it had taken everything, and he had nothing left to prove. But he spent his retirement years on the water nonetheless, piloting the harbor master's launch, teaching children to sail at the local yacht club, sitting on the dock in the evenings with a fishing pole and a can of beer, watching the sun set over the ocean that had nearly killed him. The survivors of the Ashworth held reunions every 5 years. Cahill attended all of them, sitting quietly in the back, listening to the men tell stories about the night they had almost died. They always mentioned him. They always called him the man who wouldn't stop swimming. He would shake his head and deflect the praise, insisting that he had only done what any sailor would have done. But the survivors knew better. They had been there. They had seen him in the water, seen him swimming through the darkness, seen him refuse to give up when giving up would have been so easy. They knew what he had done, and they never let him forget it. Leonard Arthur Cahill died on February 14th, 1989, at the age of 78. Heart failure, the doctors said. He passed in his sleep peacefully with Helen beside him. He was buried at the National Cemetery in Bourne, Massachusetts, his Navy Cross displayed at the funeral service, his name added to the long list of sailors who had served their country with distinction. At the funeral, a man named Theodore Kowalski, now 72 years old, a retired steelworker from Chicago, stood at the graveside and spoke about the night the Ashworth went down. He talked about the darkness and the oil and the screaming. He talked about the men who died and the men who lived. And he talked about Chief Cahill swimming through the night, pulling sailors from the water, refusing to rest while there was still one man who needed saving. "He saved my life," Kowalski said. "He saved all of us, not because he had to, not because it was his job, but because that's who he was. He couldn't stop. He couldn't quit. As long as there was someone in the water who needed help, Leonard Cahill was going to find them." The flag was folded, the rifle salute echoed across the cemetery, and the men of the Ashworth, the ones who had survived because a single sailor had refused to stop swimming, said goodbye to the man who had kept them alive. 71 survivors pulled from the water, another 22 located because of his efforts, 93 men who went home to their families, who had children and grandchildren, who lived full lives because Leonard Cahill would not let them die. The Navy never built another ship named Ashworth. The hull number was retired, the name consigned to history. But in Fall River, Massachusetts, there is a small plaque on the harbor master's building, placed there by the Ashworth survivors in 1975. It bears a simple inscription, in honor of Chief Leonard A. Cahill, who swam through the darkness to bring us home. If you want to hear more forgotten stories from the Second World War, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. These men are gone now, their stories fading with them. The least we can do is remember. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.